Eofulik, Autumn 914. Did she remember the kiss? Osrith wondered, as her company of Mersons and Alba's Mormers trekked a steady path hugging the Northumbria-Mercia border, leading slowly, inexorably, northeast. They had caught up with Ragnvald's army just past Momkvista. Being bigger, they were also slower, and it was relatively easy to ride parallel and keep them in sight. Was there even a kiss? Or something more? Mers seemed quite certain that there had been, and Osrith recalled the short encounter she had had with Hef, the Cumbraland Briton whose father was one of the cooks at Caerliguilid. Something had transpired between them, Osrith knew, but the ale she had drunk had kept her from knowing quite what. It had been a day and a half since Osrith's company had left Seaster. Now, they came to the town built on 7 hills, and a call came from Oshir and Elfkin, calling Osrith to the back. They were being followed. Or, perhaps, if not followed, then the large army behind them had happened to choose the same path as Osrith. We wait, Osrith told her men, and split them into roughly equal groups, with Elfkin, Oshir, Owain and Phelim in one, and Falkbald, Egelfrith, Engus and Miril in another. They were to watch, at about half-mile distance, who it was who was coming, and then rejoin them. Osrith would ride with Elfrith and Eswi. They would catch up, she knew, for that army, too, were not as fast as Osrith's company. A flock of geese chattered overhead as the two people she trusted most in the world stood beside her, as they looked down at the ribbon of Danes and Norse, who were inching their way through the landscape like a long, thin worm, sticking to the valleys and the low ground. Ahead of them this shimmered like the hair from an old woman's head that had caught the light of the winter sun. They were heading to Eofulik, there was no doubt about that. It's not a case of if, Elfrith said to them. They are intent on invading Eofulik, and controlling, if not all of Northumbria, a good deal of it. Eofulik was not Diria's capital for nothing. He half smiled at Osrith. But of course, you know that. Eswi gave a brief smile, too. His distant ancestors were also related to Ethelfrith the Twister, through his son Eanfrith's Pictish ancestors. Somewhere she and Eswi were related, though that didn't say much. She and Utad were related, and they hated one another. Osrith brought her horse to look to the north, and then east. It was then that a cautious Falkbald rode up to them. Egelfrith thinks he has seen more Norse, he told her, toying with his scabbard. We're following these Norse, he told her. And then a shout came up from Elfkin. Captain. Osrith whipped her rein on her horse's neck, and they were off, to the northern side of the hill. He was right. There were Norse, or what looked like them. They too clung to the contours of the land, as if a living stream. We watch and we wait, Osrith said. But Elfkin shook his head, giving a glance to Owain. Prince? Osrith asked of the heir to the Strathclyde throne. They are behind us, Captain Osrith, he told her, an agitation in his usually steady voice. A group of men came off the road and are following us. Elfrith took a few horse steps past Osrith. By God, you're right, he exclaimed. Damn. How did they ever know that we were here? The SHRRM of blades made music in the air and her men closed around her. Osrith, with buoy in hand, held her own weapon close. The enemy were riding. They had the momentum where Osrith and her warriors had none. And she gave no instruction, which was amazing, because Osrith had not trained the Mormers nor the Mersons together. They had no unifying battle strategy, or none she had developed with them. And yet they began to defend their position as if they had trained with one another for years. Engus and Phelim had turned first, and, with their Gaelish battle yell, low and terrifying, were first to attack. This gave time for Owain and the Mersons to turn and gather up speed. Stay, Miril told Osif, and gave Elfrith a look, encouraging him to back him. Elfrith looked to Osrith, who gave him a withering look. I know you will not stay, he conceded. But at least, protect the prince. We have enough instability here, in Northumbria. And I dare say Constantine will not need internal instability in Alba. It took a mere second before Osrith saw the tails of both of the horses in her direction, they too picking up speed. Protect the prince, Osrith thought, her mind darting backwards and forwards. Her men were doing what they did in battle, and needed no direction from her now. And someone had better protect the prince. The prince, however, was having none of it. Owain looked across to Osrith, with a look of sorry defiance, and before she could stop him, had followed with the others, drawing the blade which Osrith knew he could wield, and was heading in Neswy's direction, burying a blade from a Norseman, which was on a trajectory towards Egelfrith. Osrith pulled in the reins of her horse and dug her heels into its flanks, but got nowhere. At the back of her neck, cold steel blade, which caused a shiver to go down her spine. She tried to turn, when a hand pulled her from her seat like a rag doll in the hands of a vigorous child. No time for beauty, Osrith thought, as the man wrestled with her. She kicked his right wrist hard, slipping on the peaty ground as another 2 pairs of boots came into view. Behind her, a battle was raging. She could only hope fortune was on their side, and they would live, all of them. Osrith lunged at the man's legs and knocked him over, but he did not go down cleanly and she was pulled with him, a knee into her ribs. She gasped, as her lungs were impacted, but she managed to land a fist into the man's face. Before she could continue to fight, however, 2 pairs of hands pulled her roughly to her feet. The man on the floor backed away, and sat up. "You are alive, Commander," came a voice Osrith thought she recognized, but what astonished her most, as she was held tighter as she struggled, was that the voice was in Saxon, not in Norse. She turned to look at the face of the man who had spoken. It was Osferth. He helped the man on the floor to his feet, who also removed his helmet. "Oldhelm!" Osrith exclaimed, fighting against the 2 men holding her. "Oldhelm! How did you—" But she broke off when Oldhelm, Lady Ethelflaed's advisor and general, struggled to his feet. "How are you here?" And she guessed that the army following them were Mercians, not Norse, and they somehow had managed to cover a lot of ground very quickly. How, Osrith would like to know. She struggled again, and this time, swung round her fist into the face of one of her captors. "Easy, now," came a voice she knew, a voice in Gaelish. He had caught her hand, and was slowly bringing it to her side. The other man took off her helmet. Osrith took a few steps away, free of their grasp, and turned to the unhelmed man. "Cittric?" she asked, and he nodded. Beside him, the man who had spoken Gaelish to her, said nothing more. He too had removed his helmet. "Finan." "Osrith," declared Oldhelm, which solved Osrith's problem of being close to Finan. She looked back to him, taking a few steps away from her temporary captors. "I knew you had left. We had you for Norse scouts." "We too," Osrith told him. But then her attention turned to the battle still going, the skirmish between her company and, well, the Mercians. Osrith began to tear down the slope to end it, tell them they were fighting their allies. But the action was waning, and 2 men were staggering up the slope, a man each under blade. Engus had someone at blade point as she looked. The other was Owain, struggling under the grip of her brother. "They say they are your men," Utad told Osrith, baldly. "We took you to be Norse. How did you get across country so quickly?" Her tone was cold, accusing, but before Utad could answer, her reply came from her shoulder. "We heeded your advice, Osrith of Mercia," Oldhelm told her, his words soothing, seeming to cast a stillness on all the men. "And so, when you said they would be going to Eofric, I took the time to station men at Eadspirig, who, when Ragnall turned to Seaster, went off to Momcuista. We are the Momcuista garrison," Osferth told her, sheathing his sword and giving her a grin. But Osrith's eyes were in the Strathclyde prince, as Egelfrith, Eswy, Elfrith climbed the hill, Oshir and Falkberg behind, and Miral at the back. Elfkin, Osrith noticed, took the rein of her horse and held it with his. Did he anticipate a confrontation? If money were put on Utad and Osrith coming to blows, then there was a good chance of winning. Utad stood firm, though he must have realized these were Osrith's company. If anything, he seemed to hold the blade closer. "Let him go, brother," Osrith demanded, as Owain quivered under the blade. It was clear he was trying not to, but fear of being run through got to the best of people. "We are from Mercians, are you?" She nodded to Engus, who slowly let go the Mercian he had been threatening, who moved confidently towards Oldhelm. Utad, who flinched at the word brother, and despite Osrith's belief he was going to run the boy through, stepped away from Owain, who took staggering steps to be closer to Osrith and her warriors. Behind him, Felim began to charge, blade aloft, heading towards Uhtred. He stopped when the man whom Angus had released stood in front of him. "Enough!" shouted Osrith, running between them, buoy in her hand. The man turned, and she saw that it was Aethelstan. Uhtred had brought Aethelstan to fight at the Ophüc, but she could see that look of vengeance on her brother's face, and she held firm, standing between Felim and Uhtred, knowing that if just one backed down, the other would likely kill her. She remained alive. Felim, with whatever thought had been in his mind, dropped back, and lowered his sword. Uhtred turned and looked at Aldhelm. "We are here on her strategy," he told the Mercen general. "What now?" "We stay on our own," Osrith told them, with a voice bolder than she felt. "If you are heading to Ophüc, Ragnall's spies will know you are on their tail. It is likely that they do not know we follow them." She looked between Uhtred and Aldhelm. "We stay on our own," she reiterated, and translated into Gaelish. "We can ride faster than your army can march. We can divert the Norse, provide assistance should they turn to fight." She watched Aldhelm catch Uhtred's eye. Clearly, both approved of the plan. "Have a care, Osrith," Aldhelm told her. "Sigtryggr is in Ophüc." Osrith said nothing for a minute. "Sigtryggr, Ragnall's brother, who Shadowkin eloped with to marry. They are there to welcome the family, then?" she asked. Osrith did not mean it as a barb, but she could understand, a second later, how it could be taken as such. "You know nothing," Uhtred stormed, hotly. "Sigtryggr is Ragnall's enemy. You know what will happen if Ragnall gains entry to Ophüc." And Osrith did. Ragnall would take no prisoners. His brother, if he could not defend himself, nor the city, would be killed. Shadowkin too. She had children, didn't she? Father Oswald had told her that. And Shadowkin would not have left her children behind, as she and her brother had been left behind. "Even more important that we fly to the city as quickly as possible," Osrith told them. "Will you let go of my man now?" Uhtred had taken hold of Owain's shoulder again and was raising up his sword. "I agree, Captain Osrith." This was Aethelstan's voice, uncannily like his grandfather's, a ghost of words which beguiled the listener into natural compliance. She could not help to look to the young man, so full of ease and purpose. "Thank you, Lord," Osrith said, with deliberate deference to Aethelstan. "I am proud that I will fight alongside the future ex Angolorum." She saw Aethelstan nod his head, almost imperceptibly, and Uhtred did let Owain go, pushing him away from himself, and instead, took some steps towards her. "To marry, you must be free of Mercia," Uhtred said, his words painful to hear, painful that they should be said before her warriors, and his. "And to be free of Mercia, you must serve Mercia." "So I trust you," he concluded. Osrith tried not to meet Finan's eye, but failed. He said nothing, and Osrith inhaled deeply, and got to her horse. But Osrith did not get on. Instead, she tuned back to her brother. "I honor my vows, when I make them," she said to him, in Danish. We understood some of the language, and she spoke quickly enough that only Uhtred understood. Sihik too, and the brief turn of his head betrayed his intelligence into their conversation. "I make vows when I know I can fulfill them." He turned, then, and Osrith saw that he had provoked anger in her. She cooled the flame by saying, "I am truly sorry for your elder son." "Sorry, and vengeful. Should you reach Ophüc before I, do not think of killing her." "She is mine," Uhtred said, meaning Bryder, of course. "And I have never betrayed a vow." "Never?" Osrith scoffed. "Cornwallum, when you betrayed Alfred, Dunham, Bibbenberg." "What you say is pig shit," Uhtred told her. "You have allied with the Scots, and with Wiger." "He is my bother too," Osrith pointed out. They were still speaking in Danish. "And I am here for my king, Edward," Uhtred taunted. All heads turned to them now. That was a word all of them understood. "Constantine," Osrith told him, nodding to the Mormers. "And his alliance with the lady is absolute. He would not betray that bond." "I was sent here to honor their allegiance, made at the wall." Uhtred looked about her men, her Mormers, her mercenaries. He knew Constantine's claim. Constantine had told Uhtred of it himself, which would make Bibbenberg a vassal of Pitland, of Alba. Then her eyes rested on Owain, who was still shivering from the score to his neck where Uhtred had pressed his blade. "I am mercen while I have mercen men beside me." And she resisted, just in time, adding, "And what are you?" "So for your son, I am sorry. I will do all I can for Sciorra." "And you still have your second son." For a moment, Osrith felt the world tilt on its axis, as if it had turned into a giant taffel table and the game had shifted by an animal knocking its pieces about. Uhtred simply stared at her. "My second son?" And for a moment, Osrith thought he was going to fly at her. Instead, he took a step back. All of the English and Saxon speakers there, however, had heard him say this, for it was not in Danish. He was alive when Hild took him from Gisela, Osrith told him, and, just for safety's sake, pushed herself up onto the back of her horse, for ease of a quick getaway. She nodded in the direction of the line, before catching Ethelstan's eye. "We do as we intended," Osrith reiterated, this time addressing her men. "We ride to Eofuic and do all we can to prevent Ragnall and his warriors entering the city." Unopposed, they rode away, leaving Oldhelm, Ethelstan Uhtred and his men behind. "Don't think of him," Osrith told herself. "Don't remember that he just held your body," as she had to force herself to lead the way and not look back to the man she loved. She scrunched up her eyes as their horse she was on went down the ridge at the other side and tried to picture Sainid, similar in features to Constantine. He was a cousin after all, and saw images in her mind of his long, black hair and merry grey eyes, of his tender touch to her skin when they lay next to one another, sometimes just holding hands, of her promise that any unhappiness she might feel would not be his making, nor would any of his be caused by her. Osrith resolved, the burning feeling that she had, to turn back to Finan, to run to him, scorching only her shoulders and back. But she turned back anyway to see that Oldhelm was riding behind them. Osrith slowed her pace to allow the man to catch up with her. "I have elected to come with you," he told her. "The other commanders will manage the army. Aldred has the command, now. And we will meet them in Eofuic." Osrith smiled over to him. The consummate diplomat. Elected, Osrith doubted. Not out of willing choice. Necessity of purpose, she thought. To ensure her small band of men were not attempting to kingmake, were not attempting to use the opportunity to shore up an alliance with Wihir at Bibbenberg. It would otherwise, that would be an extraordinarily brilliant idea. "What do you feel about the premise that says there needs to be a Norseman on the Eofuic throne?" Osrith asked. "For now, should Uhtred would go to retrieve Sigdriga and Sciorra and take them to Eofuic, in the meantime Ragnall will have moved on to Caeligwylid. And we have no food ahead of that city to act as king in Eofuic. Guthred has died, you know, with no heir." "There is one heir," Osrith told him, "and of course, you know of whom I speak." "Owain?" Osrith nodded. "Or myself. Through Gwyddolf, my mother." Uhtred should know. While his mother was Mercen, mine was of Rhst, of the Henogled, kin to Dyfnwyl and Owain. At this, Oldhelm did fall silent for a moment, and she felt the weight of this on his mind. Clearly, then, Ethelfled did not know this. Oldhelm would have to be the one to tell her. "It is of Caeligwylid that we need reinforcements," Osrith went on, spying an opportunity. "Abbot Findel, King Dyfnwyl would both be pleased to provide them." And he added this in Gaelish so Eswi, who was lingering just behind them, could hear. "Who of my mercenaries do you trust most, Oldhelm?" Osrith asked, suddenly. "Who is the most loyalty to Mercia?" Oldhelm's pace dropped a little as he glanced around him. "Miral," he told her. "Or Elfrith." "Well, all of them, I imagine, but as they are commanders, Eswi," Osrith called, and addressed him in English, in order for both Oldhelm and her men to understand. "Take a message to King Dyfnwyl. Tell him to meet Abbot Findel at Caeligwylid and muster as great a force as they can imagine." Her horse, who had come to a standstill, turned on its feet so she could address all her me. "Tell them, the Norse are claiming Eofuic and will claim Caeligwylid and Strathclyde too. They must ensure they do not." "Captain Osrith," Eswi called back, knowing at once her plan. "It would be an honor to do so." "And it won't just be Oldhelm listening to this," Osrith thought, so she had to make it good. And to ensure that both Owain's father and your brother know you come in good faith, I need you to take Miral with you. She couldn't even look at her friend just then, for Osrith could imagine the expression on his face. Slowly, however, Miral rode his horse across to Eswy and turned the bay mare around. And when Osrith looked at them both, she saw the huge grin on Miral's face. She rode to both men, and smiled broadly, too. Both knew what it was she was doing. There were two purposes, of course, the obvious being the army, and neither man was unwilling to play his part. You add legitimacy and honor, my friend, she said to Miral, and placed a hand on his shoulder for a moment. The men you will meet are honored in their own lands, and they, too, must be warned of the threat to their kingdoms. I called both Eswy and Miral, turning without delay to the road north. The look on Oldhelm's face was priceless. He had been overseeing her men for less than 10 minutes and he had already managed to lose one of his commanders. Osrith smiled the sweetest smile she could manage to Ethelflaed's general. Then, she glanced to the road running parallel to the river. To Eofuic, Lord Oldhelm. Eofuic, Autumn 914. Does it look to you like the army has grown? Osrith's question, the next morning, having rested at a village called Hudras, was to both Elfrith and Oldhelm. Both men peered down from the higher ground that Osrith's company were following. Oldhelm looked southwest. In amongst the banners of the Northmen, near the back of the column of men fluttered many standards that Osrith recognized, the Red Hand. This was a null-aid banner, one which Domhnall Uinel had flown when the Norse attacked the monastery at Doia. It would appear so, he said, grimly. I wonder whether they have not collected men on the way. Do you know anything, Irian? Donchada and Ragnall were meant to have an alliance, Osrith added. Perhaps I can help there, Elfrith told her. And whether Oldhelm knew or not, he was going to hear anyway. The king of the north, Donchada of the Uinel, Osrith clarified. Elfrith nodded. Donchada of the Uinel had a pact with Ragnall and with Sigtryggr to live in certain areas along the east coast of Irian. Often, they would receive attacks from the Irish, which Donchada would attempt to stop, but when more Norse and Danes arrived, they pushed further west. And so the alliance broke down. Oldhelm finished, keen to get to the point. And the Uinel long wanted freedom from the Norse. Donchada and Ragnall's alliance fell. That was interesting, how much Oldhelm knew, and she stayed silent, waiting for the man to tell her some more information that he shouldn't really know, and would make Ethelflaed angry if she knew Osrith knew. And the Red Hand? She hoped it was merely representative of the Irish, and that Domhnall was not down there with Ragnall. Surely not. Osrith thought. He would never have condoned what Bryder had done. Domhnall, Osrith thought, her friend, and little Neil Grubbyknees. Were they at Donchada's displeasure? Were they amongst the Irish with Ragnall? Surely not. They would surely go to Constantine first. He agreed to the installation of Sigtryggr and Stiora, as Uhtred told you, Oldhelm added, carefully, pulling Osrith out of her thoughts. And it was widely known that Ragnall was set on conquering surrounding Northumbrian territories. Ethelflaed agreed to let him pass into Northumbrian up the Merse. So that was it, a pre-arranged alliance with the Ivasan brothers. Uhtred's scheme, no doubt, bringing an army for his disposal not 100 miles away from Bibbenberg. Only, I am guessing, Osrith replied, slowly, as she watched the men ride on, entertaining themselves with whatever game they were playing by counting the Norse. The lady did not bank on Ragnall attacking Seaster or Eadspirig. In fact, the longer she thought about it, the more it made sense. If Constantine knew all of the facts, which he surely did, he would be pleased that Dyfnwil and Caeligwylid's armies were to head south. Eswy, no doubt, would get a message to him in any case. And, apart from the attacks in her territory, to get Ragnall as an ally would be a huge achievement for Ethelflaed. But it would, too, be a turning point for Alba, for an ally south of the wall would make it the work of a moment to take and hold Bernicia. Bibbenberg was small fry compared to the ancient land of the Idings, from the Forth to the Humber, which they had taken from Pitland, and at Bibbenberg, Where would probably continue not caring who ruled what beyond his walls. So, who are the Irish? Asked Osrith, suddenly. If Don Chada has been successful in the Norse expulsion, his enemies. Please don't say Neil, or Domhnall, she begged silently. What of poor Gormlaith? Ancient memories, safely stored, were scattering themselves around Osrith's memory. The UNA tilde copyright hill have yielded hostages. The Allied had fallen and have wasted no time in organizing themselves as mercenaries for Agnall, Aldhelm told her. She glanced down at the winding army. So they were allied. Don Chada, under the Uineals, had finally claimed all of the territory of Arion, including to the northeast of the island. Then they owned half of the country now. King Malmuir's first husband, would have been overjoyed. He is not the first unifying king in these islands, Osrith told Aldhelm, as the land dipped slowly downwards. Alfred, she clarified. Alfred, Aldhelm agreed. But others have claimed it off of Mercia, for one. But she was not the only person to be thinking about Ireland just then. Just then, Finan was also looking at Ragnall's line, and was thinking about his brother. 88,888,888. It was her mistake, in the end. It had happened on the afternoon of the next day when they had stormed a weaker part of the line just outside Eoferwick. A stupid mistake, but it had delayed the line. That much was clear. The bishops were roused. Sigtryg was alert and the city gates were barred. Her men had fought valiantly, and had retreated, as Osrith wanted, around a corner and up onto a hill. Osrith would have got there too, except that her horse had thrown a shoe, and was staggering. Elfkin and Elfrith were riding back as 3 Norse were chasing her, and Osrith decided to abandon her horse and run to them, run as fast as she possibly could, towards the shouts of encouragement in 3 languages. It was not enough. From the side of her face Osrith could see an axe coming towards her, and she threw herself into the mud. Horses whinnied. And that was the last thing she could remember. It was dark, where she was, dark and cold. A small window at the top of where she was not betraying sunlight, so Osrith assumed it must be nighttime. She was alive, at any rate, and did not appear to be hurt. She got to her feet. A brief look round told her she was alone. So, alive, unhurt, alone. At Eoferwick, who could say? It was the only sizable settlement near where they had harried the line. But they must have had some success, hadn't they? All was quiet. That meant, either the city held, under Sigtryg and Stjora, or Agnall had unequivocally succeeded in ousting his brother, their household, their staff and any Christians within Eoferwick. She would have to watch, and wait, and listen. The language would be the key here. It didn't take long for Osrith to find out. Weak, autumn sunlight infiltrated the close-packed bars of the cell, and with it, snippets of sentences, phrases drifting down to her like falling leaves. Norse with some Gaelish. The expelled Allied were in the city's main square and were keeping guard at various points. A rattle to the door made Osrith jump out of her thoughts and she turned to see an ironclad oak door open. Here, the man said to her, in Norse, may you avoid eating the poison within it. Osrith took some steps to the door, and bent her head to the tin plate which the man had placed on the floor. Some rank-smelling meat invaded her nostrils. But she scooped up the plate anyway, for she knew she would have to eat as much as she could. What did you say? Osrith asked, in English, hoping to give the impression she knew no Norse. Our Lady Brida sends you food, the man said, and looked slowly towards the meat. Osrith made to pick at it, away he was still looking at her. Then, she looked at him. May you give my thanks to Lady Brida, Osrith told him, in English. And I congratulate her victory. And, speaking of victory, she still had how was it that she still had her sword? As she bent her head to begin to eat, she heard the door creak, and then hurried steps crossing the damp, dank straw. No! The man shouted, as he dashed the plate away. No! Bad meat. Osrith jumped, no longer playing a role, at the violence of the gesture. The man stood back and looked at the floor. Already starving rodents were boldly scurrying towards it. Bad meat? Osrith repeated. Then, she hung her head, acting again, is Bryda going to starve me? But the man had already taken a few steps back. He made to say, but stopped, for there was a blade at his back. Starve you? Came a voice she knew. I would never starve a Krejikvind. Bryda, dark hair in braids, pronouncing the words in Danish very clearly, stepped out from behind the man, sword point still towards him, working it round to his chest. Guthric, you are a poor guard, she told him, looking up to the man and narrowing her eyes. You told the prisoner about the poison. No, Guthric exclaimed. I did not, Lady Bryda. He exclaimed. But this seemed to infuriate her more. You stopped the prisoner from eating the poison, she told the hapless Guthric. You gave in to mercy. She was not Krejikvind to you then, so you have no excuses. And with as much thought as a chef might give a joint of meat, Bryda pushed her sword into the man's chest. Osrith watched in horror at the apparent casualness of it all. Guthric did not bleed a good deal, but he slumped where he stood. He looked at Osrith as he fell, and his open eyes were still on her as he stopped moving. Bryda, Osrith exclaimed. She was in no mood to pretend. This was a woman who had cut off the private parts of a priest to get back at his father. She had just executed a guard and seemed indifferent to this act. Bryda looked at Osrith, her face expressionless, but she did lower her sword. I was once in the same position that you are now in, Bryda said to Osrith. Not the same, Osrith told her, hoping with a shared memory, the suggestion of compassion that Bryda was showing her, where the Cymric showed her none, that she might provoke some sort of shared empathy.